I listen to sports podcasts generally.
Those are really, I started listening to this called Steve Austin podcast about like wrestling, pro wrestling. It's actually incredibly engaging. Any other like favorites podcast wise?
Nerdist's podcast.
Nerdist is supposed to be cool. I've been meaning to check that out. Yeah, I saw a fist bump back there. Somebody likes that. Yeah.
Izzy Video.
Izzy Video?
Yeah.
I'm mostly just asking this so I can check these out later. What is that one about?
Video production.
Izzy Video? And then all the way in the back, did I see a hand?
There are two that I really enjoy. One is Civil War Talk Radio, which is he's a Michigan guy, but other than that, he does really well. And he teaches at East Carolina and does a really magnificent job every week. And then, interestingly enough, BYU Radio does something called Top of Mind every day that becomes a podcast after it's aired. And their guests are always interesting and really diverse. So
That's great. Okay, well, I think I have a convert possibly here if somebody's into history podcasting. I'm going to go ahead and plug us today. I might go back to the... So I am here from Origins, and has anybody heard of origins.osu.edu? I see a couple in the room. Okay, these are people that work with me. Okay, so obviously we have, invested interest. But this is great because this is a program out of the history department that we're really trying to kind of spearhead. And I was a graduate assistant for this, so I'm a grad student here at Ohio State. In the history program, and instead of doing the usual teaching thing, which I do love, one of these semesters I was slated to help organize and run essentially this Origins site, which is essentially trying to put history into current perspective. And this is always something, I think this is something that's kind of a common theme, and what I'll talk to you about is trying to make us relevant. And so I think that educating through podcast is really trying to make what you're teaching relevant in like a new and interesting way. And so that's kind of what History Talk is trying to do. So Origins has a million different features, which I could probably talk to you all day about because I think they're great. But essentially it's a podcast, or it's a website that's really focused on looking at these current events. So obviously there's inflation in Argentina, and looking at the larger historical trajectory. This is like our main feature. We have the main article every month, and I'm pulling this up because I'm going to just show you all of this. So before we had the History Talk podcast, essentially what History Talk was sound. We had somebody reading off this entire article. There are 2 pages. So there would be one of the grad students who would have to go through and read this entire thing. In a sense, that was what our podcast was. And this aired on WYSO. It took about 20 minutes to read. And I mean, I don't know if you guys would find this incredibly engaging. She had a lovely voice. It was really nice to hear her, soothing, but in a way, like it was almost too soothing, right? So the idea behind creating History Talk, and this is like great to have Byron before because you're giving all the like details on how to. This is like, we were thinking of what to do with sound, how to make sound into something more engaging, like a podcast, right? So there's a difference between podcasting and just producing sound. And so what we decided to do is make it just more than one person. That's as simple as it was at that moment. And I think that there are plenty of podcasts that do feature like one person talking, but you have to be an extraordinary speaker to make that work, I think, or just have it in an extraordinarily short time. So we moved to like talking to experts, and the experts that we know best are historians. And this is something that doesn't seem initially like very engaging, but I think the greatest learning part of this was that historians are actually really great talkers. And this is us also trying to market ourselves as being like, all right, public intellectuals, right? Academics also really have a voice that's interesting and relevant, and we show how. And that's kind of the major idea of History Talk. So this is our History Talk webpage, and kind of going into like the basics. Essentially, it is kind of like a more roundtable discussion where Patrick Patiandis, the other host, and myself will sit down and essentially talk to 2 to 3 historians, or sometimes we'll get somebody who has great knowledge in the field to talk about what buying American elections is like. So election season's coming up. This is one of our more popular ones. We just talk about campaign finance reform, which doesn't seem like incredibly interesting, but when you have 3 people kind of arguing about it a little bit, it adds a lot more perspective and interest to that conversation. So that's what we've become. And kind of the process behind that I'll run through with you guys, because I think that the one thing about podcasting is that anyone can do it. I really mean anyone. And I think that's why it's great to start getting educators doing it and to actually have students do it in the classroom, which is something like Laura Seeger, like in the history department, and I know Patrick and I have like talked about a little bit more. So thinking about just the production, right? Like, what do you even do? How do you take this sound and make it into something? And Byron already did a great job of describing other programs. But as an undergrad, I had some background. I worked at WOSU for a while as a productions assistant for All Sides with Ann Fisher, if any of you listened to that. And it's kind of amazing, like, how simple radio is. Like, I'm not trivializing it at all, but we use the same programs, essentially, to trim our podcasts that are free, that WOSU used. So it's not a very difficult task, but having that familiarity with what audio looks like on a screen was really useful. So essentially what we do for the History Talk podcast, just to walk you through the production, is we go to ASC Tech. So it is produced by Paul, we have in the back, and also Scott, like, help us amazingly sound like this professional quality sound. And like, you have the professors walking in. Has anyone been to the ASC Tech studio? Okay, obviously you're all familiar with it, I'm sure. But it's amazing. Like, people will come in and they'll be like, I didn't realize that this was legitimate. And so that gives us a sense of legitimacy, right? But it also allows for this. We are not legitimate. No, but the thing is, like, we started off with this small snowball microphone. I don't know if you guys have seen these. Mm-hmm. We still have it. It's kind of this antiquated, like, little white, kind of cute thing, but it had the worst sound quality ever. And I remember the first podcast, so we've done quite a few at this point. But one of the first ones we did, you could hear the toilet flushing in the background because we're right next to the bathroom. I think it was... Ambiance. Yeah, nice ambiance. I think it was like we didn't do the crime yet. It was on the Middle East. Anyway, so it's really this amazing quality of sound. So then you get this sound that's totally leveled. You have people, if they're coughing into the microphone, Paul's able to erase that. If they're taking a sip of water, like, it's erased, and you're given this beautiful nugget of sound. And then Patrick and I use Audacity, the free program that has been mentioned already, to edit it. And it's so easy. I mean, you can play around with it a little bit. There's a fade out function, fade in function. Like, it just gives you the basics. And I think that the free part of that is amazing. It's this open source thing that works fairly well and can give you all the tools you need to essentially just create a full-length podcast. And so the trimming thing, I think that what Byron said is completely correct. You can just trim off the edges a little bit, but I think part of the power of podcasting is this storytelling aspect and the power that you do have as an editor depending on what you want to do with this. And I think this is something that's a really cool educational tool that is more than just like crafting an essay. Like, you are crafting a story with other people's words, but you can make them say what you want, which is this really weird power trippy thing, right? Like, if you cut out somebody's comment and they respond to somebody else, you can make this like conversation have a totally different kind of hold. And so when we do like this editing, essentially, first of all, we were just trying to get these conversations into 20 minutes. I don't know about your attention spans. I think personally 20 minutes is like a good one for me, but that's like general podcasting world, right? Even 5 minutes is like seen as like this totally good nugget. 10 minutes, like you have, but I feel like it's the 30-minute threshold. This any longer than that, unless you're like This American Life, you can't hold that attention because you have to tell that story and you have to do it well. So essentially, we just tried to start cutting out that 20 minutes, which was hard to do when you had 10 minutes over because academics love to talk. And this is another challenge that I think maybe like we can talk about too, like we can all face, is that it's hard to keep things concise. And again, this is like a way to kind of bridge that, I think, public kind of ivory tower gap, is like, how do we talk to students and how do we talk to each other? And then how do academics talk to the broader world? And so cutting out a lot of that diction was difficult at first. And then it was even more difficult when Doug proposed that we do a 5-minute segment for WCBE. What do you do with 30 minutes? How do you make 30 minutes into 5 minutes? And so that was like a really big challenge that we kind of started to face with that. And so the editing thing becomes a lot more time consuming when you have to consider like, how do you make 30 minutes into 5 minutes, and how do you make the argument make sense? And how do you represent somebody appropriately? So like personally, I remember my advisor was on a podcast and I thought she sounded great, but I think I cut out part of the previous person's point because he was going on too long. And she said, I remember responding to so-and-so's point in this way, and if you cut him out, I think I don't sound great. And I was like, I think you sound great, but people know what they're saying and they know how they talk. And so it's just a really interesting kind of learning experience and how you really can change how somebody comes off. So that's like something interesting to kind of keep in mind. And this is like part of the difficulty, I think, in podcasting and in making podcasts accessible. Making them accessible is easy. So we have this site, and then we also have a SoundCloud. Which, have you guys heard of SoundCloud before? Awesome. I feel like SoundCloud is probably one of the greatest things. We sprung for the like $100 a year, I think, or it might be $80 a year to have unlimited access and unlimited uploads. And this is the most useful thing in terms of judging who's listening. So we also have it on iTunes. We have it linked to the site, but you can't always tell how many views. You can tell how many views you get, but you can't tell who's listening. So SoundCloud as a method of seeing how many people are actually listening has become our like most useful tool. And as you see, it's still very modest by like This American Life means, but we had our most popular podcast yet is Understanding the Middle East. And these are the kind of topics that we broach. And I think that also, let me see if I can find it.
We use SoundCloud too. The nice thing is it gives you like an iTunes feed and all of that stuff, so you just have to post it in one place.
Yeah, which is great, and you can link it. So this is, again, another thing you can embed it. So we send it to our friends over at Fair Observer in the UK, and they're able to take our podcast and embed it on the page. And this is what gets us even more listeners, right? And so this is, again, like that method of access. And it's really, really cool to have somebody who's reposting our podcast, essentially, which is really great. But even though we have all of this, it's still like a hard thing to make that an engaging 20 minutes and have people speak very short, short, concise points in ways that isn't necessarily like touting their own research all the way and is still like considering a larger conversation. So I think that that's one of the greatest challenges, and that's been a really big learning curve for us. Even when we ask questions, we want to make sure that we're asking the right questions. And I think that that's also another rule of podcasting. You need to ask the right questions if you're doing this kind of like interview type podcast, because some things elicit the best responses that you don't even like anticipate. And I'll always ask follow-ups, and I feel like going in with like this set list of questions isn't always the best way to do it. You have to kind of see where the conversation is at. So it really is just a method of like studying people when you're in the studio too. So like Doug had mentioned like a question of like how to get started with podcasts. Does anyone have their own podcast started yet? Here? No? Okay, obviously I am besides Doug and obviously Byron. Is anyone interested in starting their own podcast? All right, I see a couple hands. So I feel like this is the one like most obvious rule is just to do it, just to start recording. And this is something that we started to do with History Talk. And so I think that that's why it's the most obvious rule. And you're not going to always know what you're doing, but you have to get started somehow. And the easiest thing to do is gather sound, get sound, and then decide what to do and where to go from there. And so we just kind of started recording. And then, the show kind of takes the form. Like, I feel like everything develops more and more. Like, you listen to early, like, Marketplace or early, any NPR shows all evolve as well. Like, you have an idea, you have a concept, but you kind of find your pace and what you sound, your sound, essentially, as you keep going. So I would say that. I'd say just get like your cheap recorder. You could use your iPhone. You can use your regular phones. This is the most amazing thing also about podcast accessibility. When I was at WOSU, reporters would just record calls on their iPhones and then broadcast that on the radio. It's that easy to do, and the quality is actually fairly good. So you can record on your phone. There's some pretty inexpensive recorders on Amazon. You can spend up to like $150, but I have this really wonderful quality that records in like a WAV format. It was about $50. So really accessible, an investment, but easy to do. So you start recording and then download Audacity and just start editing and start deciding what you want your voice to sound like and create something. And I feel like that's the most rewarding thing, and you can kind of build off of that. So I'd say to get started, just do that. Just cut parts of conversations. See how you can craft something that does kind of form a narrative or form some sort of point that you're trying to get to, and then look that way as well. So I think you also mentioned social media kind of thing. So like going back to marketing, I think I've shown you, we also have our History Talk and Origins Twitter, which is featured prominently and amazingly on our site. So I'll just show you like ways we try to market. So we will post on our Twitter like links to the podcast. And right now, history podcasts are doing surprisingly well. As we heard about the Civil War Talk Radio, sounds great. There's also this one, I think I did write it down. Well, you have Backstory, if anyone's listened to that. It's also a great podcast. Stuff You Missed in History Class, which is my friend's go-to for trivia nights. She'll listen to that, and she always gets the history questions correct. And then they have like this one, also, you must remember this. That's this big one that I have friends that are starting to listen to like left and right, and it's just focused on old Hollywood stories. But I think that the thing is that these have over us is that they're still telling it this interesting narrative, like talking all about like, I don't even know, Jimmy Stewart or something. Like they have somebody who's really interesting. So we're still trying to figure out how to like appeal to a broader audience. But really it's like a lot of policy and historical kind of work talk at History Talk. But essentially I feel like podcasts are experiencing this huge boom right now. Like you have 1,000 podcasts. So I think the difficulty becomes in making yours stand out and making it relevant and also making it have its own voice. So we don't want it to be just like backstory. We don't want to be just like, you must remember this. You have to kind of carve your own space and say, we do this that this podcast doesn't do. So yeah, I'd be happy to answer any questions, but that's essentially History Talk. Thanks, guys.